Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Angie Atkinson, and I am a park ranger here at Gettysburg. This is the second lecture that I've done through this series. Oh, I forgot the first one. First one was on the Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association. And this topic today about contraband camps and freedmen is much different than our traditional maybe battle or personality type focused lectures. This one was a little bit interesting and difficult to put together. When you're talking about contraband camps, you're talking about poor record keeping. And you're talking about a situation that arose out of necessity and that they were kind of dealing with and modifying on an as-needed basis. No one kind of thought about this beforehand. So what we're going to do is take a look at that. I'm just going to tell you right up front, we're not sticking to 1864. The story is way too big to just look at 1864. We're going to go back to how some of this started, especially in the Mississippi Valley, and then kind of move on up. So we'll probably spend a good 45 minutes to an hour going through some of this. The sources, I know everyone kind of brings up books and whatnot. Like I said, researching this, you're kind of digging through a lot of different things. A couple of the sources that I used, one is available online. It's a downloadable book if you go to Google Books, and it was written by John Eaton, called Grant, Lincoln, and the Freemen. And Eaton will be a primary character in this story, because he's kind of Grant's right-hand man when it comes to managing these freedmen camps. And so he leaves a memoirs of reminiscences, and that was a wealth of information for me to use. I also used a historical study of the contraband camp at Grand Junction, Tennessee. That was also online. I was able to bring that up. And then one of the books that is kind of near and dear to me is called The Black Experience in Natchez. This was written by Professor Ronald Davis out of UC Davis in California. I'm not sure if he actually still teaches there. But when I worked in Mississippi, his students would come to our park, to the Natchez National Historical Park, where we owned a plantation, an estate home, where the planter lived in the city, owned about 20 slaves, but then his plantations were scattered up and down the Mississippi River, where he owned over 300. Now, Professor Davis would bring his students in from California, and they would do a wealth of research on the Black experience and other projects that they had going. And he published this material many, many years ago. But that was one of my primary sources for the camps in the Vicksburg and the Natchez area. So they're kind of scattered hither and yon. Now, this is not to mean that there are no sources on the Black experience in general. USCTs, the fight for freedom. I mean, there's numerous titles, but when you really delve into the contraband camps in specific locations, those were the sources that I used. So we will look at these camps, and we will look at them in their kind of evolution, their management, and the consequences of these situations. So the title, like the Oncoming of Cities, comes directly from John Eaton. He would say, "Imagine, if you will, a slave population springing from antecedent barbarism, rising up and leaving its ancient bondage, forsaking its local traditions and all the associations and attractions of the old plantation life, coming garbed in rags or in silks, with feet shod or bleeding, individually or in families and larger groups, an army of slaves and fugitives, pushing its way irresistibly toward an army of fighting men, perpetually on the defensive, and perpetually ready to attack. The arrival among us of these hordes was like the oncoming of cities." And I think as we go through the program, that quote will be very apropos for the experience that these individuals, not only the soldiers and the commanders that had to manage the freedmen and these individuals coming from the plantations and coming from towns, but also the freedmen themselves. But they were most likely and most often referred to, or before I move to that, this is the map of the camps. The northernmost camp we will look at is Cairo, Illinois, Grand Junction, Tennessee. That will then move over to Memphis, Tennessee. We'll travel down to Davis Bend, Mississippi, and then a brief discussion of Vicksburg and Natchez, Mississippi. And like I was saying, they're most often referred to as, these individuals, these families are often referred to as contraband. There was no real understanding of the status of Southern-owned slaves after the Confederate States had engaged in the American Civil War. This starts to become an issue. What are these, beyond people, but what is their status? And the debate is, are they property or are they individuals? Now, it's going to be ironic in how they are looked at, because as a slave on a plantation, they are considered property. They are taxable, they are accountable, they are purchasable. However, one of the main reasons for this war is to provide them rights of a human being. And so those are obviously at odds with each other, but when the military comes in, they actually have to and maybe start to look at these individuals initially also as property, as spoils of war. We go back to something called the Confiscation Act of 1861. And this is basically stating that any property used by entities while engaged in insurrection against the government can be seized and declared government property. I mean, it's basically saying that any former slave brought into the Union lines could immediately be put to work as a cook, as a teamster, a general worker, etc. But what it did not articulate, that initial Confiscation Act, was whether or not they could serve in the Union Army. How else could they potentially be utilized by the Union? One story about the first reference, or the first usage of the word contraband, looks to General Benjamin Butler. And he is at that point in Fort Monroe, down in Hampton Road, Virginia, and he will learn that a number of slaves had made their way across Hampton Roads to receive safe harbor from the Confederate-occupied Norfolk County. They will present themselves at the Union-held fort, and General Butler refused to return the escaped slaves to the slaveholders who supported the Confederacy. And he is one of the first potentially to use the term contraband, that they are a contraband of war. But we still need a clear definition of who these individuals are and how they should be looked at by the Union Army. By the Second Confiscation Acts of 1862, now the President is going to specifically articulate in those that freedmen could serve in the Union Army. Now, one thing to keep in mind, freedmen that could serve in the Union Army, we have to be very careful about how things are stated. Just because one is free doesn't mean they are entirely free. Just because they could serve in the Union Army does not mean they're going to the front lines. So while some things were allowed, I think the full objective of those is, never quite met in reality. And the Army is not all on the same page. Now, General Grant is commanding the armies down in the Western Theater, and he is looking to try and figure out what to do with these individuals that are leaving the plantations, that are leaving the farms, that are leaving the towns, and looking for refuge within the Union Army. Not all slaves are plantation slaves. Some of these individuals are working on yeoman farms, some of these individuals are working in towns, some are working at estate homes of these planters, but they're coming from a multitude of directions. Grant needed clearer language regarding the treatment of these individuals and the management of these larger groups. He is in Mississippi and Tennessee. He's got supply bases in that area, and he is concerned about not only what is he going to do with his army, but now what is he going to do with this massive population that's leaving the plantations, the farms, the towns, and the cities. In a letter to his sister, he would write this. He said, "The war is evidently growing oppressive to the Southern people. Their institutions are beginning to have ideas of their own, and every time an expedition goes out, more or less of them follow in the wake of the army and come into camp. I am using them as teamsters, hospital attendants, company cooks, etc., thus saving soldiers to carry the musket. I don't know what is to become of these poor people in the end, but it's weakening the enemy to take them from them." He had tried to send some of these individuals north. It made perfect sense. Why would you want to stay in the South where there's definite bias, racism, elitism that is there, the reality of an African American getting a good job in the South at that point was almost impossible. So it made complete sense to go to the North. And unfortunately for Grant, that plan failed. There was not a willingness and open arms to welcome all these freed slaves now into towns and cities that had never before had a populace that was African American. So it was not an easy transition for Grant. It was not an easy transition for other towns and cities to basically find that social hierarchies were disrupted. So what does that leave? It leaves allowing them into camps, allowing them into the Union Army camps. And while that's going to happen, Grant's not going to receive additional provisions for them. He will have scarce provisions, living off the land, provisions provided by the overall army for his soldiers. But no one is counting on an extra 10 to 15 to 20,000 people to feed, clothe, shelter, provide medicine, medical care for. That was not in the original plan. And now that is completely upended with all of these families and men and women coming into the Union line. His army was being taxed, and he had to reconcile this. What do? Do you ignore the problem? Do you move the army out and just head on somewhere else and tell folks sorry, but you're just going to have to figure it out on your own? He couldn't do that. He had to reconcile this and initiate something to care for these people while also managing the resources for his army, because he did have that other objective. The other objective is to, basically eradicate the Confederate Army from the South, to take over ports, to engage in warfare and end up the ultimate victor. Grant is stuck in the middle. He knows that the orders of the government prohibit him from expelling the Negroes from the protection of the army, and they will, quote, humanity forbade allowing them to starve. So he couldn't release the African Americans from coming into camp, and he couldn't not feed these people. He could not allow 10 to 15,000 individuals to starve. With such an army of freedmen of all ages and both sexes as had congregated about Grand Junction, Tennessee, which is where Grant had one of his camps, amounting to many thousands, it was impossible for him to advance. What it's basically boiling down is the army is starting to take over or absorb this overwhelming number of individuals. And it's not an easy transition to life on a plantation or farm into freedom. For many of these individuals, it can be a very scary, unnerving experience. And I put one slide up here. When these individuals leave the plantations, many of them are completely illiterate. They cannot read and they cannot write. It is very easy to wave your hand and say that you are free. It is very different to be standing at a storefront and to not know what prices are of goods, or to be standing at a train station and not understand that a ticket is required, or not to be able to read the storefront signs. Those that were functionally illiterate, who might be able to read and understand certain words, concepts, and phrases in context, might have had a little bit easier a time, but as soon as they leave the area that they know, which literally may have only been a 5 to 10 square mile area, they are out of their element. It's just as if we were to take possibly all of us and remove us to Siberia. We would probably not be able to assimilate very easy. We probably don't understand the language. We probably don't understand the culture, the customs. And so that was something that was also going to, in the long run, hinder some of these individuals. It is a very big transition from a regimented life where you are in constant fear of punishment, of reprisal for maybe not working hard enough, for being ill, for whatever, into now the fact that, in a sense, you can come and go as you please. But all of this, all of these phrases, there we go, actually, while they state it, they probably never understood it. It was very hard to understand. When I look at that, when those phrases, each one of those sentences said, "You are free," in a different language. If I had to go to a part of Russia, just, because we had the Olympics most recently, and I had to try and understand what was in front of me, it would be virtually impossible. Could hardly even put together that alphabet, let alone a different culture and custom. So there's not only the army having kind of a situational adjustment, but it's also these newly freed African Americans that will have to, deal with adjustment as well. But who is in charge of this? We've got individuals coming into Grant's army in Tennessee. Grant can't leave these people to kind of suffer on their own. He has to, in a sense, assign someone to handle this matter. And that is going to be this individual, chaplain to start, John Eaton. Eaton was born in 1829. He is the oldest of 9 children out of New Hampshire. He began his formal schooling at age 3, but ended at age 5 when he was deemed old enough to start working on the farm. After that, he only attended school in the winter months. His father was very, very strict. He was not someone who embraced education, but he embraced labor. And so once you were old enough to start handling those chores and those farm tasks, that's where you were, rather than reading a book. His mother, however, encouraged him to read all through his working on the farm and through the little education that he got. When she passed away, he spent many nights with an oil lamp on his chest, poring over books on Latin and chemistry. Only once did he drift away into a peaceful slumber to be awakened by his burning clothes. With his father completely against education, the younger John Eaton here, with the aid of his sister, did not allow the evidence to be found and quickly burned his night clothes in the kitchen fire. He eventually was allowed to attend a school in Vermont. Mr. Eaton, for whatever reason, allowed his sons to go to some type of further education, an academy in Vermont. And by taking on odd jobs while at school, but then also work on the farm, he eventually secured entrance to Dartmouth. After completion at Dartmouth, he would move to Ohio. He would become superintendent of the city schools in Toledo, and he began at that point to study the ministry. He was ordained in 1861 and would eventually become chaplain of the 27th Ohio. And as I mentioned earlier, it is from his writings that we will glean most of our information about the contraband camps and the freedmen experience in the Mississippi Valley, because he would end up becoming the superintendent of them. But we'll look at the camp in Grand Junction, Tennessee. The other thing that I want to mention is that a lot of the photos and the sketches that you'll see are really being used more for illustrative purposes. It's very hard to find specific photos from specific camps. The documentation is scarce. But I think overall, from some of the photographs and Harper's Weekly illustrations, we can kind of paint a decent picture of what life was like for many of these people. Their condition was appalling. There were men, women, and children in every stage of disease and decrepitude, often nearly naked, with flesh torn by the terrible experiences of their escapes. Of women in travail, the helplessness of childhood and old age, the horrors of sickness and frequent death, as written by John Eaton. He is looking at individuals who, you're barely clothed on a plantation. You would get one pair of pants and one shirt for the season, and that would be it. If the owner or the overseer was, if we can use the term loosely, a little bit kinder, you might have received additional clothing if it was cold out. But there was really no concern for making sure that the labor force was warm in the winter and appropriately dressed in the summer. There's numbers of pictures of these individuals in rags, literal rags. And that is what they are bringing with them into these camps. Disease is going to run rampant. Many slaves, especially from my experience and my research down in Mississippi, is that they would be suffering from some of things that we would find completely unimaginable. One female, I don't remember if she was referred to by name within this specific letter, but they talked about her having pain in her head and in her, I guess, sinus cavity. Whatever she had, whatever caused it, I don't know. But it basically turned out that she had worms. And this is not the extreme. This is, can potentially be part of normal daily life. Pneumonia is going to run rampant. Dysentery, bacteria. Many are unclean in that they probably have been traveling and moving away from plantation. But it's not just the plantations that they're moving away from. It's also some of the owners, some of the citizens of towns and farms that see them moving through these Confederate-controlled areas. Once you leave the plantation, doesn't mean that you're good to go. You have obstacles and threats the entire way until you reach that Union camp. He mentioned that children were in various states of decrepitude, the old and infirm. We aren't driving anywhere, we're walking. We might have a wagon if possible. So it is a very heart-wrenching scene as these people arrive at the Union Army. Eaton will receive an order in November of 1862 that in Grand Junction, Tennessee, informing him that he is now in charge of the contrabands that are coming into camp. And to him, the wave and wave of individuals coming into camp is just absolutely overwhelming and insurmountable. When he gets this order from General Grant, he is very, very concerned about it. He is probably concerned on a number of levels. First of all, he's going to LaGrange, which is where Grant's headquarters are at this point, and he's going to go talk to Grant and say, no, there's no way. There's no way that I can be in charge of these contraband camps. And he had a whole list of reasons. I mean, it ran the page. Here's where I can't do it. I can't do it because there's too many of these individuals. I can't do it because there's not enough supplies. There's not enough direction. There's not enough support. I also have to wonder, though, if there wasn't his own personal fear in caring for these individuals. Number one, it's a lot of responsibility, but number two, is it a task that possibly he wanted to take on? I mean, I'm thinking outside the box. He goes to Grant and he lists every single reason. He had the whole speech prepared. He was, ready to plead his case about why he's not going to be able to do this. And Grant sat and listened, and he didn't interrupt. But then when Eaton was done, Grant reiterated his order that Eaton would eventually be the superintendent of these contraband camps. But he didn't have a precise plan. And he will write to General Halleck and he will say, what will I do with them? Grant doesn't know. I don't even think the whole Union Army knew. Washington, D.C. didn't really know. They didn't have a plan for what they would do. Halleck would respond with this. The Secretary of War directs that you employ the refugee Negroes as teamsters, laborers, etc., so far as you have use for them, in the quartermaster's department, on forts, railroads, also in picking and removing cotton on account of the government. So far as possible, subsist them and your army on the rebel inhabitants of Mississippi. So that just tells me that Halleck is telling Grant, you're basically on your own. You're going to have to figure it out. There's no more supplies coming down from Washington. We don't have any extra money to give you. I don't think we've got extra clothing to give you, but do what you can where you are. The camps that would be set up for these individuals, the term camp is going to be used very loosely. Old tents were used, sometimes buildings were used if available. It's kind of a piecemeal type of situation. Eaton would have to start seeking out the healthy and the sick because his hope was that if he could contain those that were sick, they might not pass those diseases further on to the rest of both the army population and the freedmen, the newly freed population. At Grand Junction, he's going to house the sick in the railroad station. And he will note that the clearing of the camps of the sick and dying, suffering with contagious diseases, was a task for a national sanitary commission rather than a young chaplain of volunteers. He is one person. He is one person to handle thousands of people coming into these camps. He would note eventually that his camp would end up looking much like one down in Vicksburg, Mississippi. It was difficult to get assistance. Very few people volunteered or offered their services to help. There would be one soldier, one Union soldier, for every 1,000 contrabands. Overwhelming, little got accomplished. When you have a ratio like that of one Army individual to 1,000 freedmen, it was very difficult to monitor, to control, to assist. And again, assistance was not willingly forthcoming. Many of these individuals had to be requested to go to these freedmen camps, didn't want any part of going to the freedmen camps. There was also an expectation that the freedmen would instantly, for some reason, come into these camps and just help themselves. For some reason, coming into this camp, they would instantly change from years, decades, centuries of servitude and be able to just instantly start a farming operation, a banking industry, a grocery operation by themselves. It's a very high level, almost an unfortunately high level of expectation that the freedmen would come into these camps and simply begin life anew, as if all sins of the past were washed away and life was great and could begin again. And that wasn't happening. Eaton noted that probably one of the reasons why is that they had become so completely broken down in spirit through suffering that it was almost impossible to arouse them. I can only imagine what it would be like to leave that type of life, if you can call it that, and then walk into a camp and be literally expected the next morning to rise at dawn and go out and guess what? Work the fields. Is that really what they were hoping to do? Is that what freedom looked like to them? To go back out on a farm and continue the same thing that they were doing, just simply in a different location? Yes, probably under the idea that they are free, but the life looks very similar, even though it's under the idea of freedom. Eaton will make numerous trips to Grant's headquarters in LaGrange to try and request guidance, supplies. I think even though initially he didn't want any part of this, he did end up throwing himself full force into this process and trying to make the camps as best as he could. So he's looking for supplies, direction, and he will gain authority. Who's going to listen to a chaplain when he's given orders? He has no rank. He has no power among any of these other soldiers, and Grant will start to realize that. And he will soon, through different orders, start to promote him up levels, so that way when Chaplain Eaton says something, it can actually get done, and he's got some weight behind his orders. Grant's willingness initially to provide some of these things, like rations, soldier clothing, and tools for camp, was at Grant's own risk, since he did not have explicit orders okaying the distribution of what is government property into some of these camps. And if it was to be called back, Grant could actually get in a little bit of trouble for having dispersed some of this without direct authority. But he would soon leave his headquarters at LaGrange and his direct support as well. He would have to continue his army operations. He could not remain in this same location. Slowly, some of the freedmen had taken over some jobs like gathering corn and cotton left on plantations. Some of them were able to gin and eventually get the cotton baled, though again, that's the type of work they had been doing previously. But it would, the way that many of the members of the army were looking at it, is that that would make profit. If you could get the cotton, if you could sell it, that would make profit for the army. But the freedmen were loath to go back to that type of work, and understandably so. Eaton also tried to do something where he would put these freedmen back to work on plantations with individuals that were more union-leaning. That would make sense. But also, he wanted them to be put back to work on the plantations because the farmers or the plantation owners themselves had to start getting used to the system of paid labor. There had to be a reconciling of the fact that these individuals are here, they can and need to be employed, and we're going to have to start dealing with the fact that while they were enslaved at one point, they are now free individuals and deserve to be paid a fair wage. And since the freedmen had the skills, if we can use that term, knowing how to run the cotton gins and presses, they could fall right back into that line of work, but now be paid for it. It met with resistance, don't get me wrong. And tensions were high. Eaton was not liked. He was not liked by citizens of these neighboring counties and towns, and in fact, he was the victim of an assassination plot. He, would ride his horse around to all these different areas. It just so happened that one individual borrowed his horse, and a shot rang out. Luckily, it struck the horse, and the horse was shot out from under this different individual. But his horse was known, and it was very obvious that the assassination attempt was for Eaton, not for this other soldier. He would eventually visit Grant in Oxford, Mississippi, when news came of Van Dorn's burning of Grant's supply depot. And with that, Grant will now issue another order to elevate John Eaton. Chaplain John Eaton of the 27th is hereby appointed General Superintendent of Contrabands for the department, signed December 1862. This order elevates Eaton, but also provided more direction on how the contrabands could be used. As I mentioned earlier, the wages could be garnished to help in feeding and providing for them, because remember, the Union Army didn't get anything in addition to that. But to me, it has the scary foreshadowing of what would later become the system of sharecropping, where while you were paid for your work, so much of a percentage went back into the farm, to the company store, to the credits that you owed. It was a cyclical life that you were never able to escape. But the camp at Grand Junction would not be safe for long. Grant had to move the army, and with that he had to move the freedmen camp with him as well. And they would head on now to Memphis, Tennessee. The opportunity to move to Memphis, they would do so by rail. They would travel on trains, but the freedmen were so afraid of being left behind that while the soldiers were taking the trains first, the freedmen actually overran the cars, the boxcars that were going to carry these men from point A to point B. They had to, they were climbing on the tops of them, hanging off of the ladders on the sides of them. The train literally moved at a crawl because it had people just, on every open space, because the freedmen did not want to be left behind. There was a camp set up south of the town of Memphis, and again, the intentions were to employ every person in a job suited to them, but it was proving difficult. They wanted everyone to move to the south, at least as far as the freedmen camp, so that way the pressure would not be left on the city of Memphis. And Eaton himself now found that this was not just one camp that was going to exist, that multiple camps were being formed, organized, managed, all throughout the Mississippi Valley. There were that many individuals coming from, the hinterland into places of safety and security. He had to, as this organization was growing, select officers, and these individuals would have to be crucial. You can't expect great management out of someone who doesn't want to be there, because the Union Army is not open arms to these individuals. There's still a great deal of racism within the Army at that time. So the officers he had to select, he had to do so carefully. He would request Lieutenant Samuel Thomas to become the Assistant General Superintendent, and they would find that as their work continued, rather than many times helping the individual freedmen, they spent a lot of time becoming the middlemen between trying to employ the freedmen on these plantations and having to talk with and persuade the former owners to allow them back on the property as paid labor, as wage-earning laborers. And so it was a constant battle between life that was and the new life that many of these individuals were going to have to embrace. But the ultimate goal was to provide a foundation for these freedmen so that they would be self-supporting and not as dependent on the camp and the management. Eaton tried to keep people in familiar trades and skills that they brought with them. He enforced the contracts that were signed by the wage earners and the former plantation owners. He explicitly said that they could not be violated, and he found that this was an issue that needed to be held firmly to restructure relationships for the long haul. Another type of contract that was issued was of a different sort, and that was one of marriage. The unions that were formed in the fields were actually made legal in the eyes of the law. And Chaplain Fisk, in 1 hour, in one of these camps, married 119 couples, many of whom had been together for years. And according to Chaplain Eaton, this improved morale greatly. I mean, here was an opportunity for these folks who had been together for, who knows, 10, 20, 30 years. That union never necessarily being legal or maybe real in the sense of the law, we're now able to commit to each other and have that relationship sort of solidified. It was just one of many things that were attempted in the freedmen camps to try and bring back a level of, what would be the word? Normalcy, I guess, and equal rights to all. It didn't get there, but it was an attempt. One of the freedmen would act as a preacher within the camp. And Eaton couldn't say that whether or not this helped, but it did provide one interesting situation. During a burial, this African-American preacher was at the service asking for prayers. And evidently, according to Eaton, it seemed to be the custom to offer a prayer for Jeff Davis while they were on the plantations. And so as he's walking by this service, he hears the preacher oblige, and having considered the situation, said, "O Lord, shake Jeff Davis over the mouth of hell, but O Lord, don't drop him in." He was probably being a little kinder than maybe others might have been. Another preacher within the camp was living with someone other than his wife and was admonished to bring the wife to camp and to discontinue the relationship that he was currently in or face expulsion. The preacher informed the union officers that he had prayed and prayed, but that the Lord saw no reason for him to change. Chaplain Fisk, following the orders that he had been given, had the gentleman removed, and he and his companion died from smallpox soon after. However, the effect on the community was so great that Eaton noted, "No other apostles of the doctrine of free love disturbed the settlement's morality at that point." Another camp would soon spring up in Cairo, Illinois. Cairo probably most famous for the gunboat. Those of you who have heard of the USS Cairo down at Vicksburg National Military Park. Well, Cairo is right on the river, and that's going to be another transportation hub. It will become a center for fleeing freedmen and poor whites, actually. Those that are displaced by war as well and also looking for employment. Those that were individuals that are looking to live by hook or by crook were militarily guided toward vocations. You were not going to sit in the camp and just use the camp's offerings. You were not going to steal and commit crimes. You were going to find something to do, if you had a skill. Eaton notes that when he returned to some of the areas after time had passed, that the whites, dirt poor initially, had been enterprising enough to turn themselves around. He noted that to some of the poor whites in these situations, especially here at Cairo, that the slaves were not a guarantor of self-respect or social standing, but hard work was. Eaton quoted writer Edgar Gardner Murphy on the problem now facing the South, though. The arrival of the common man, which is this introduction of social classes alien to the planter and slave relationship. The camps would not fare so well up north because there's going to be a tension that arises between the poor white class and now these newly freed individuals. Because what are they going to be competing for? The same jobs, that same level of occupation. Some may have skills loosely, some may have no skills at all, but now you have a direct competition. If you are a poor white, you're not going to be owning a plantation. You're going to be eking out your existence somewhere. And now, for many of them, they have this direct competition to them and someone who is their equal. So that will cause friction in some of the camps up north. Lorenzo Thomas, Adjutant General of the U.S. Army, would state this about the Cairo camp. He said, "At Cairo, I first came in contact with what were then called contrabands, over 1,500 men, women, and children huddled together in insufficient quarters. The helpless drawing rations from the government and the able-bodied men employed in the various departments as laborers to the extent that they were required. Compensation, $10 per month. And one ration per day. I found the mortality of the place had been very great, especially among the children, measles, diarrhea, and pneumonia being the prevailing diseases. And this subsequently I found to be the case at all other points visited by me where large numbers were collected. I found the treatment of the blacks varied very materially at the different military stations and by the operating columns. Some commanders received them gladly, others indifferently, whilst in very many cases they were refused admission within our lines and driven off by the pickets. They were thus obliged in numerous cases to return into slavery." So here a description where not everyone's on the same page. And while the freedmen may officially have been allowed into the camps, it doesn't always mean they actually were. It doesn't always mean that people were always following the letter of the law. James Yeatman, who's going to become president of the Western Sanitary Commission, would also write this about the situation in the Mississippi Valley. He said that the freed Negroes in the Mississippi Valley is daily becoming worse, and that there are not less than 50,000, chiefly women and children, now within our lines, between Cairo and New Orleans, for whom no adequate provision has been made. No language can describe the suffering, destitution, and neglect which prevail in some of their camps, which he has in quotation marks. The sick and dying are left uncared for, in many instances, and the dead unburied. It would seem now that one half are doomed to die in the process of freeing the rest. The idea of disease running rampant through these camps is very accurate. I think we can only imagine what some of these diseases do to a body. We have vaccinations. Most of us are probably lucky to have been vaccinated as children or later on as adults. We don't deal with most of the stuff, or haven't dealt with most of the stuff that these folks are probably living through, or that did live through during this time. And I think his last statement is very eye-opening, that one half are doomed to die in the process of freeing the rest. Simply by moving, some perfectly healthy individuals, simply by moving to those camps and hope to become free, are probably going to contract something that may very likely end their life much earlier than it might have. Continuing down the Mississippi River, at Davis Bend, Mississippi, named after Joseph Davis, older brother of Confederate President Jefferson Davis, is another area that will become a freedmen camp, a contraband camp. Davis Bend was 25 miles south of Vicksburg. Now Vicksburg is right up here, and Davis Bend, if you can see the bend right here in the river, that's what that is going to be. This was an area, one of the areas that would be owned by Jefferson Davis's brother Joe. About 1,000 acres would eventually be used as a contraband camp. In April 1862, as the Union forces were tightening their grip on the lower Mississippi River, Joseph would flee inland from his river plantations, taking with him his family and some of his slaves. One individual, or two individuals, pardon me, Ben and Isaiah Montgomery, would actually remain at the plantation. They remained at Hurricane, which was the name of the plantation, to protect the house and the grounds. But, however, the war had exposed undercurrents of slave discontent not previously suspected by Joe Davis. He had tried to have some sort of utopian community in his mind, which was obviously not the reality. And the community of cooperation that he had was now collapsing here. It was no longer people working together. It was people realizing that this was not the life that they wanted to lead. Threatened by intermittent raids by both Confederate and Union soldiers, Joseph could only watch from afar as his white overseers deserted and his trusted servants joined in the looting of his possessions and freed in wholesale numbers. Confederate forces burned his cotton. They obviously didn't want the Union Army to get it and sell it for profit. Union raiders destroyed the Hurricane plantation, stripped one of Jefferson Davis's old plantations. The Montgomerys would close a store that they had there for a time, and they struggled to provide for the rest of the remaining labor force at Davis Bend. Their efforts quickly overwhelmed by wartime social disintegration, however, and they too would eventually leave the area. And this small picture here, which I found, is actually kind of interesting. It's when you look at it as a whole, an individual noted that these small houses were the slave quarters of the Jefferson Davis plantation. But if we take the picture and rotate it, this photo was sent home by Elizabeth, missionary to the freedmen. When they got to the camp here at Davis Bend, an agent for the Cincinnati Contraband Relief Commission would write this about what was going on at this location. He said, "One of the women had the smallpox, her face a perfect mask of scabs. Her children were left uncared for except for what they accidentally received. Another woman was nursing a little boy, about 7, whose earthly life was fast ebbing away. She could pay but little attention to the rest of her family. Another was scarcely able to crawl about. They had no bedding. 2 old quilts and a soldier's old worn-out blanket comprised the whole for 35 human beings. I inquired how they slept. They collect together to keep one another warm and then throw the quilts over them." That's 35 people basically huddling next to each other, simply to keep warm at night. "There is no wood for them nearer than half a mile, which these poor children have to tote. Hence they have a poor supply, and the same with water. The only vessel they have to carry it in was a heavy 2-gallon stone jug, a load for a child when empty. They were filthy and will all probably have the smallpox, and a number of them will likely die." This is the condition of Davis Bend, Mississippi in 1864. So for those freedmen that remained on that plantation, Joe Davis had left. He had taken his family, he had scattered from the area, and they were attempting to eke out their existence there, and it was a struggle, to say the least. They had tried to farm the land collectively by the slave refugees, and then separate parcels from 5 or 10 to 100 acres by individuals that would actually lease out the land from the government. That was another system that the Army tried to employ, in that you would have an individual leasing the land who would then again hire the freedmen as laborers. But the sad story is that it doesn't really work out. In the long run, for much as they tried, as they struggled with this, the leasing system would not be one of the strongest ones that would happen. A number of the individuals would find that the labor was inconsistent, the wages were inconsistent, the wages were not enough, but also, again, go back to that idea that these individuals who are fleeing the plantation life probably have no desire to go back and do that type of labor. There is no reason why they would want to return probably and work on a farm. When the schedule was very similar, there was actually one of the documents I looked at had a list of an overseer's day. All right, so 6 o'clock, everyone's up. By 6:30, everyone's out in the field after a quick breakfast, and it itemized the hours in the day and the times. And then it was very interesting to see the military day or the laborer's day. All you did was flip the name of who managed it, and it was very much the same. So I'm sure that was a struggle for these individuals. Natchez occupied after the fall of Vicksburg. Brigadier General Ransom occupied the town and was at once overrun with former slaves coming from all directions. He would write, he said, "I also desire some instruction as to what policy I shall pursue with regard to the Negroes. They flock in by the thousands, about 1 able-bodied man to 6 women and children. I am feeding about 500 and working the able-bodied men among them. I can send you any number encumbered with families. I cannot take care of them. They are all anxious to go, but they do not know where or what for." And I think that speaks volumes in and of itself. The freedmen flocking into the town of Natchez, which is going to have about 3,000 people, is going to, Ransom was very correct. They want to go somewhere, but they don't know where and they don't know exactly what for. What type of jobs or employment they might have. They don't even know where, but they know they want to get out of what they've been doing. And anything at that point seems better. That camp that they might go into seems better than life on the plantation. General McPherson, one of Grant's corps commanders, would write back to General Ransom. He said, "With regard to the contrabands, you can say to them they are free, and that it will be better for them, especially the women and children, old and infirm, to remain quietly where they are, as we have no means of providing for them at present. With regard to the men who are strong, able-bodied, and will make good soldiers, you can bring them with you to Vicksburg, and if they are willing to come and will leave their families behind." Remember, though Vicksburg is in federal hands, as was Natchez, there were partisan units in the hinterlands that were not going to make this process easy. Just because the town may be under Union occupation, and just because the idea is floating around that these people are free, does not mean that everyone in the 80 miles between these two cities is going to allow that process to happen and happen easily. Because many of them refuse to abide by the Emancipation Proclamation. For plantation slaves, this is a significant roadblock, not only to freedom, but to even leave. For some, even the idea of leaving the plantation is just as dangerous as life in one of the freedmen camps. Because can they even make it from the plantation to the actual camp itself without being harassed, possibly killed, or re-subverted back into slavery, obviously not by their choice, by some other guerrilla unit that was out there. This is a very famous map for the Mississippi River area from Natchez down to New Orleans. Has anyone ever seen this before? It's called the Persac map. I really need a bigger slide, a bigger room to really show you the map, but if you look at it, it's in 2 parts. Starting here is actually Natchez, Mississippi, and this is the Mississippi River running down all the way down to Baton Rouge. It starts back up to Baton Rouge and goes all the way down to New Orleans. All right, does that make sense? You'd have to put them like on top of each other. Every pink or blue wing that you see coming off of this is a plantation. The plantations always butt against the river because that's how you get your merchandise out. That's how you get your cotton downriver. The biggest port that you're going to send it to is New Orleans. It's got to go south. So if you can take a look at all these different areas, a plantation, depending on the size of it, depending on what it farms, whether it be sugarcane or cotton, some were timber, not many, but would have anywhere from 100 to 300 slaves per plantation. Some owners, of course, that were wealthier would have more. So just taking a look at that map, per each pink or blue section, that could be 100 to 300 to 500 people vacating that area and looking for relief from the Union Army. That doesn't include the town slaves that lived in the city of Natchez. So for example, one individual, John McMurrin, that owned the estate called Melrose, had 20 slaves, 16 probably at one time, at his townhome. There were probably 30 other estate home owners who had slaves in the town as well. So this is when this is what I talk about when I say that people are coming in droves. This is why. You can see the number of plantations, and these are just the big major ones along the river. There are going to be other plantations that are going to be more interior to both states, Louisiana and Mississippi. Typically, they're not the highest tier, but nonetheless employed slave labor. So, there were instances of the Army focusing more on what they could exact from the labors of freedmen rather than their overall well-being. The leasing system was one of those. By leasing plantations to government agents who would work the freedmen on a wage labor basis, they could also enlist able-bodied African Americans as soldiers into colored regiment. You've heard of the USCTs that would be formed, that would operate as home guards, protecting women, children, and the elderly. And they were also establishing black refugee camps near Natchez for kind of everybody else. The idea behind the work plantations was to use what the freedmen knew, skills they had to help them adjust to the new life before them. So you're going to see this system kind of used in all these different locations. The leasing system wasn't just in Davis Bend, but it was also down in Natchez, Mississippi. Growing cotton would provide income, and hopefully the freedmen would learn new business aspects, how to manage a farm, because that may have been done by someone else when they were used as slave labor. So in theory, it provided them the foundation to eventually become self-sufficient and, in theory, move toward a middle-class existence. Those who decided to enlist in the ranks could demonstrate their equality in their service to fight for their freedom, while the refugee camps would function as temporary centers helping the unskilled. The sick and displaced, they might be able to find jobs, find a place to live, but usually nothing would come to fruition. The plantations were racked with disease, poorly managed, everything understaffed and under-equipped, specifically the plantations that were going to be leased. Washington, D.C. will eventually appoint General Lorenzo Thomas to organize the refugee program, as John Eaton was simply becoming overwhelmed. He wanted the freedmen to work to cover their overhead, and he set about securing white landowners to hire the freedmen at fixed wages. Black patrols would monitor the situation and protect the plantations from Confederate partisans. There's these rogue groups that are out there that are harassing the freedmen, the camps, and these new work situations that are being put into place. Initially, the labor would be $7 for males, $5 for women, $3.50 for children ages 12 to 15. So those individuals would receive that type of compensation for their work. But it was a disaster. Nobody cared, nobody monitored, and no one paid and no one took responsibility. So again, it's great in theory, but nobody wanted to follow through and really try and help implement the system. Eventually, the Treasury Department would take over and assigned William Mellon and James Yeatman to revise the Thomas's program. They increased the rates to $25 for males, $18 to $20 for females, and $15 for children, but again, it didn't work. Most did not want to make contracts with individuals. Most didn't want to pay this amount of money when they had been using this labor for free. Remember, the former slaves from Natchez are not running up to Vicksburg to go into those camps. They are going right to Natchez. And so guess who's going to be hired back out to work on those estates or those plantations. So everybody knows each other, loosely. So you've got the former planter who's like, I'm not paying $20 for said individual when that person was on my plantation 6 months ago working for free. So there starts to become this tension that arises for that. Across the river, direct from Natchez, there were over 37 government-leased plantations with a total of over 4,000 workers, constantly hit by rebel raiders. And this is also going to dissuade anyone from really being interested in leasing a plantation. It was a sticking point with the owners. Why employ these freedmen if it just makes your home, farm, or livelihood a direct target? And I think that's a fair assessment. If I'm going to try and embrace this new system, I've been a planter, okay, fine, my whole world's been upset, I now have to hire these individuals. Okay, I'll abide by that. I hire the individuals, but now that makes me a prime target for everybody else who doesn't like the system. And we're going to take out your family, we're going to take out your whole plantation, we're going to take out any type of money you're trying to make in a way you're trying to rebuild. And of course, the freedmen who had been recruited for the black patrols have limited training, limited experience in this type of position, and are really no match for these guerrilla units kind of coming in and raiding. In fact, some plantations were hit 2 or 3 times a week, pretty common. Thomas Knox, who was one of these individuals who signed a lease for the plantation, said, nearly every day I heard of a fresh raid in our neighborhood, though after about the first half dozen visits, I could not learn that the guerrillas carried away anything, for the simple reason there was nothing left to steal. Eventually, the raiders, for Mr. Knox here, they're going to kill his overseer. They will capture kidnap 19 of the workers, and they steal 24 mules and horses off of him. So for him, this is a lose-lose situation. He's not making any money. He has destruction to his leased plantation. And some of these guys even began recruiting private armies simply to protect their land holdings and farming areas. But here in Natchez, they would have a refugee camp. And actually, let me back up 1 second. If you'll notice here in the map, called the map of the defenses of Natchez, this large red area up here is Fort McPherson. And that is going to be a fort made by freedmen labor, but also it will house some of the contrabands. Most of the those that are not able-bodied, the refugees, are actually going to end up down here on the coast. What you can't see is that the town is actually 300 feet higher than this area here. And we would refer to this as something called under the hill. Literally, it's a bluff. The town stops, drops sheerly off, and then there's kind of there was a tiered area that became the docking area, the ill repute area, but also eventually to house some of these individuals. There would be contingents that were housed at Brown's Lumber Company. Let me move back to that slide. So here you have a rendering of Under the Hill. Here you have an actual photograph of part of that Under the Hill. This is today, right here, this is called Silver Street today. And you go up and the town sits on the cliff, literally on the bluffs. This is the only street that remains. The river has changed course and shifted, and with that, it basically ate up all of this area. Now, this is the southernmost portion. There's actually another portion kind of further up here that would also be kind of under the hill. Not the more famous Under the Hill, but that would also be where they would house some of the refugees as well. But one of the saddest chapters is going to be here in these refugee camps. Under the hill and across the river in Vidalia, Louisiana, and to the north to the town of Washington. Refugees were coming from all of these different locations. And the principal camp was located under the bluff and contained as many as 4,000 refugees in the summer of 1863. One northerner estimated that 1/2 of these individuals had died by the fall of 1863. the camps, the freedmen experience, at least as far as, going to contraband camps, camps run by the armies, was pretty hard. I think by no means stepping away from this presentation, and if you go back and read some of the materials, would one say that the experience was easy, or that the experience was one that the freedmen would find, salvation and help and aid in these camps. The camps were simply more struggle in another place. They were organized to a degree eventually, but they were not. They were managed by individuals who I think had some good intentions, but then they were also not. The thousands of individuals, as the one quote I read, talked about them fleeing, but they did not know to where or from what, where they wanted to go, or really what they wanted to do. And I think that was a huge blow to the possibilities for these individuals. It was a struggle. And what would happen is, this is simply the foreshadowing of the struggle that will take place for easily the next 100 years here in the Deep South. The fact that with many of these individuals being illiterate, with them not having a well-managed system to escape these areas or be transported to different areas, many of them will literally fall back to the lifestyle that they knew. The grass was sometimes not necessarily greener on the other side. So they knew this type of lifestyle. Some of them would go back to the plantations, others would not. But many of them are putting themselves in harm's way just so that others could be free. So with that, I'm going to conclude the program. I want to thank everybody for hanging in there. We went a little bit over. But if you have any questions, feel free to come on up and we'll chat. But if not, please, as you're going home today, drive safe, be careful, and get ready for the impending storm.